Howdy, welcome to the Fishbowl. Today we're joined by our friend Ian, and we're going to talk about archaeological findings from the ancient Near Eastern cultures and how they reconcile with the biblical account of them. So, Ian, if you want to introduce yourself and just get on into it.
Yes. So thank you for having me on the show, guys. So today we're going to be focusing on secular archaeology with a biblical lens. And so that's something that I really like doing regarding sciences. But people hear Christians talk about, oh, evolution could be true, but God used evolution. And so they merge biology with faith. Or the Big Bang Theory could be true, but it's when God said, let there be light. And so they merge physics with faith. But I feel like something that is seemingly just as contradictory in archaeology is rarely talked about in the Christian education setting. And I feel like people have the habit of being two-minded, like double-minded when it comes to talking about secular education sciences versus religion. Or whenever I'm at my biology class or my history class, sure, we could talk about cavemen, but I don't seriously put thought towards what that really means in regards to the Bible unless asked in a religious setting rather than a secular setting. So the three main things we're gonna compare is the three parts of human history of when did humans start, when did civilization start, and when did empire start, which archaeology defines those three things in its own way. But for starters, what do you guys think?
Well, yeah, that's all really cool. I do agree that the Big Bang Theory, evolution, it's kind of old news at this point. That we can reconcile those. Everybody knows that already. I think mostly in the intellectual Christian spheres, not even just the Catholic one. Everyone kind of agrees. Yes, evolution happened. Yes, the Big Bang Theory happened. But yeah, we don't really talk about the archaeological findings as much. I guess they're probably not as mainstream because they're a lot more complicated and detailed oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Things like evolution, the Big Bang Theory are very easily digestible to the general population. So yeah, no. Aaron?
Yeah. First of all, I love this topic. This is incredible. I think it's nice that we're all very scientifically minded. We're all very science focused. I mean, I know you were math major, civil engineering, and chemical engineering, so got a lot of math focus here. I I think this is also probably a topic that we're all pretty well read on. I'm going to do my best to focus in the commentary just more on the historical context of the Bible and more of the beauty aspects, because I know we've got all the scientific aspects covered. So I might be a little off the scientifically beaten path, but I'm gonna try and do that intentionally just to give an extra side of it. But yeah, I think that it's very important to realize that the Catholic Church has come up with a majority of the big scientific discoveries. People within Catholicism, have been the main pushers of science, honestly, and research throughout the centuries. And like you were saying, people tend to separate the two, and God is the author of science, God is the author of mathematics, God is the author of all of the things of the physical world. And so it's beautiful that we can see the intelligibility of creation from any standpoint, whether it's sciences, mathematics, archaeology, the genealogy, anthropology, anything like that. We can see it and read it very clearly through the lens of the Bible, and find that even if the texts don't match up exactly, you can really delve into is the Bible trying to be literal here? Did people 5,000 years ago, whenever they orally brought forth Genesis, did they really have a detailed scientific grasp on how the world was made, or even any kind of understanding close to us right now, and what they really would have wanted to convey and meant by it? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
And historically, science and religion were seen as a pair way more frequently by culture. It's more
Yeah.
of just the modern age of like having like mental superiority in regards to religion, and like, but truth is truth, you know? So like if
Yeah.
you want natural truth or supernatural truth, it's still truth. It's not going to contradict itself as long as it's properly sought out, you know? So starting question really is when can we say that the Garden of Eden and Adam were created? And so that was a question that was posed by an Anglican bishop named James Ussher in like the 1650s. And so this is the guy who really popularized like the young earth um, sect of scientists. And essentially, if you look at Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, it says, I'll read a little bit. So, when Seth had lived to 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. Skip ahead. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Canaan. Skip. When Canaan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel, etc., etc. So, it literally has the number of years in Genesis from Adam's creation to Noah. And then later on in Genesis 11, it goes the same exact formula. Noah at this age had Shem. Shem at this age had etc. And it goes all the way from that to Abraham. And so really, this archbishop just put a year to when Abraham was born and then counted backwards from that to get a good estimate as to when the Garden of Eden and Adam were created. And so we don't need to go over the details of how he like locked down Abraham's age, but there is more like biblical sources and archaeological sources. And it's not controversial to say that Abraham was born around 2000 BC. And so if you take all those years from any of your good old home Bibles and count the years back, that means that Adam and Eve were created around 4000 BC or 4004 BC, according to this archbishop in the Anglican Church. And so if you ask now a secular historian what's going on in 4000 BC, guess what? It's actually the earliest date we have for Mesopotamian civilization.
Yeah.
So is that a coincidence? Perhaps, perhaps not. But the greater point I want to make is Genesis, the Bible, like tells us and gives us like a pretty fair estimate that 4000 BC was when humans were created. And yet we have multiple Homo sapien skeletons that are dated to like 100,000 years.
Right.
So that's like a 98,000 difference between the earliest humans that we know of from archaeology versus the Adam. And like some people can debate like how accurate is carbon dating. Sure, like that maybe we trust that too much, but that's still like a huge margin of error. That's not like they're off by a couple thousand years. 98,000 years off from the creation of Adam. And so the first topic I want to get into is like, when was the first human created? And so that gets into the question of evolution. And turns out the Catholic Church has a specific stance on evolution, which is like, you know, you don't need to believe in evolution to be Catholic, but also you can believe in evolution and still be Catholic, permitting two things. That first, you specify that the creation of the first life was a supernatural miracle. It wasn't just a natural primordial soup became a cell somehow. And then secondly, you need to insist that God, in a supernatural act, infused the first soul into a human. And so, given those two things, you could actually reread Genesis, and it says, God created man in his image, right? And that is Adam. It doesn't say, like, Adam was the first Homo sapien. It says he's the first man, and he says that God created man in his image. But if you're going to talk about perhaps there were Homo sapiens before Adam, then maybe a more accurate reading of that verse is, and God made the first man that was in his image, which means like God finally gave a man a soul at that point in time.
Right. Yeah, and it. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I know it's a notable thing is that he made Adam out of the dust of the earth, right? Which it's not really that much of a stretch to say like Adam's made out of earthly material, so he was like physically assembled in the way like other things are, and then God supernaturally imposes like the breath of life into it.
Right.
So yeah.
And
I actually have a good number of coworkers that are young Earth creationists that are very, very, very deeply Protestant. And one of the funniest things that I think is that they'll bring this up a lot. They like if they know you're Catholic, they'll ask you your stance on a variety of things. And one of the things that we have talked about a lot is, why do you only like? I'll ask them like, why do you only believe that the Earth is 7,000 years old, basically, and like, why do you believe that the first humans were, and all that stuff. And their answer is, always somehow seems to convey that like it was cooler that like God just snapped his fingers and like made everything. Whereas my position is like, yeah, like maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Like again, like you say, the Catholic Church doesn't really have a ruling on it that you need to definitively believe. But like to me, isn't it cooler that God used natural processes to bring about like he doesn't supersede nature often and just like completely like smash it. He uses natural things in order to bring about his own designs. And in fact, that's, like he's participating with his creation in what happened. And if he decided to use evolution to bring about the eventual rise of humans who were made in his image, like that just seems way cooler than just like snapping your fingers and like poof, here's like a guy and a girl that just like appeared out of nothing,
Yeah.
And that oh sorry.
My confirmation saint is Saint Francis, and something that I really like about Franciscan spirituality is there's a huge emphasis on like an incarnational worldview, which is you see every aspect of nature as like a little bit of God or a little bit of God's identity is shown through it. Because how do you best know the creator? By getting to know his creation, right? And so like him using natural processes is so cool to me. But that granted, I'm not trying to like dispute creationism, because like that is still like a perfectly valid like intellectual stance to take. Whereas like, yeah, we can say God created Adam from dust like in an instant, and then ask the question, so how old is Adam? And it'll be correct to say 1 minute, while also being correct to say he's like in his 30s. And like that's not a contradiction of like the earth was created in an instant, but still has evidence of older years. Like God can create a full-grown tree that will have rings indicating it's 60 years old, but it will really just be one moment old. And that's like the kind of consequence you have of a supernatural being creating stuff, But what were we gonna say, Ryan?
Yeah, I was gonna say it's not like there's a competition between like the natural order of things and God's design. Like he designed every inch of how nature works, right? So if anything, he could have designed nature for the express purpose of generating Homo sapiens, which he would then breathe life into. So yeah, pretty much what you just said. Every other time, God seems to act. Most times, God acts. He uses like natural things as his like canvas, so to speak, right? Like he doesn't create the bread of life out of thin air, or he doesn't create his flesh and his body blood out of thin air. He uses like existing matter. Whenever God shows up in the Old Testament, it's usually like there's an angel doing it for him. So he clearly like uses things rather than do things like directly, explicitly himself.
Yeah, and like at the wedding of Cana, was the water really necessary? Like he could
have just
made wine in the pots and jars, But there is a poetry of filling it with water and having the obedience to God, and him using like something, a liquid to a liquid rather than nothing to wine.
Yeah.
But,
Well, I think nowadays, like, there's just this general, like, literalist mindset that's not even just in, like, scientific communities. It's, like, people talking about the, like, inspiration of the Bible. And we might say, oh, this could be inspired and inerrant, even if it's not literal. And some people say, well, if it's not literal, it's just false. And I think, like, it's, like, that's just a general mindset that's pervaded the world nowadays. Probably, I don't know, the Enlightenment or something has something to do with it, but
Yeah, that is a really important point. And like a lot of people who are atheist will look at the Bible and say like, you Christians are stupid because, you know, again, like you said, we figured out that like evolution, like here's the oldest human being, and here's, if we use mathematics, here's when your Bible says that, you know, humans originated and they don't match up, and like we trust carbon dating, and therefore like your religion is wrong and we're correct. And I know that like when I was in college, we read a book. It's called Walking with God. I would recommend it for anyone that's like very interested in the historical context of the Bible. And it kind of goes through the beginnings of Genesis. I don't have the Bible pulled up, so I'm not going to read any of it. But it was where he talks about the way that the earth was created. Right? It's like very clearly, if you read into the language, it's very clearly detailing and like relating the earth to a temple. Right? Like it talks about like the pillars of the earth and like the dome of the sky and all of these things that are like, yeah, if you read them literally, like they sound pretty stupid because, you know, we know that the earth is not like a glass sphere and there's not like water on the outside like in space, you know, but like the way that they wrote it was intended to convey the building of a temple, right, which was to convey that the world and all of creation, in fact, was a temple wherein God dwelt, right? And again, because they weren't advanced at all, they're not going to bake in like this isn't like a conspiracy theory files where it's like, oh, we found like the formula for carbon dating in these like ancient people's writings. Like, no, they're poets, you know, like they're trying to convey the beauty of creation in the only way that they know how to, in like 4000 BC in an oral tradition, you know, like this is the beauty of the Bible. It's not a scientific textbook because a lot of those advancements came later. And so there's stuff to derive from it in the way that the ancients saw the earth and how it was connected to God that are very, very far removed from a scientific worldview and are things that can't be judged by science because, again, science isn't the all-encompassing view of how the world should work, right? Like there's very important other facets, you know, that are part of us being human and part of how we view the world that are meant to be seen as well.
And like, it is important to have like that poetic understanding of Genesis. And like one of the common things that people bring up is like God made the earth in 6 days, and like that's a debate of like scientists versus religious people. It's like, okay, well, it's now common knowledge that we say, oh, the word day came from a translation that really just meant like era or age, and it's like a poetry thing of like you can etc. like stuff like that. But regarding the chapters of Genesis that like say this person begot this person, it's some strange numbers, like, and also strange names from each individual person, from Adam to Noah and then Noah to Abraham. And so I read that and I'm like, if there's like a poetry angle to this, it's really peculiar that they chose these numbers, and like it's a very like historically written like paragraphs of Genesis where they do not make much embellishments at all. It's just this guy at this age had this son, his son at this age had this son, on and on and on. And so essentially like that's what sparked me wanting to go down this rabbit hole of like, okay, like how literally can or should we take these years to be? And so if we're like counting them back, there's like a obvious contradiction of Adam can't be the first Homo sapien if we take like the natural sciences literally with like archaeology and biology. And so like, what am I just gonna look at this Bible and say nuh-uh, or like just like really bend things like as far as I could possibly stretch them? It was like, oh, he made man in his image, as in like maybe like he made a man, that this one was different because he was in his image. Like I acknowledge it's a stretch, so I want to give like a little bit more biblical evidence towards my point, which comes from the story of Cain and Abel. So I'm sure we are all familiar. Cain gets jealous of Abel. Cain kills Abel. God punishes Cain, right? And so I'm going to read a little bit from that, where right after God tells Cain what his punishment is, and he's going to be exiled and he's going to be a wanderer, Cain says, and so Cain, in Genesis chapter 4, is like, no, God, don't do this to me. Whoever finds me is going to kill me. It's like, think about what that verse is implying. Cain is like the fourth human being mentioned in the Bible. And he just killed the third human being mentioned in the Bible. And it's like, so what? Like, you're potentially, like, your sisters and your parents? That's who you're worried about killing you right now? And that to me is like an indication of, okay, that's supporting evidence of there are Homo sapiens that were outside of the Garden of Eden. And what makes them different is that they weren't of Adam's lineage, and they were just Homo sapiens. They weren't humans in the sense of they didn't have the functions of the soul. And so when you look into the archaeology of that, it's humans exist for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and they're smart. They have cave drawings, they make tools, they have organized hunts, and it's like we look at all of that like, oh, these are humans. It's not like a silly little chimpanzee that got just too smart. But then in secular human history, we make an important distinction from when we were just hominids that made tools and maybe had some agriculture and really basic language, but mostly just hunters and gatherers, versus now we have civilization. And so turns out that distinction, that the beginning of civilization with Mesopotamia, lines up pretty well with this verse with Cain and Abel. And literally the next verse right after Cain accepts his punishment is titled Beginnings of Civilization. That is what Genesis says for chapter 4, verse 17. And so it's Cain's making settlements with his descendants, and same thing with Seth and them. And so there's something different now. There's a distinction of what was before, like hunters and gatherers, and what is now. And the difference that archaeology says for settlements versus civilization, because we have earlier evidence of human settlements where they lived in a spot, but civilization is different for a few specific reasons, where they're defined by a writing system, a government, specialization of labor, and urban centers. So now people are living like in community. People are interacting on a higher level with specialization of labor and government and writing, and they're recording history and stuff like that. And so that's a significant distinction that secular people make about human history. And so that begs the question that I'm going to ask you guys of what is the actual difference between the hypothetical Homo sapiens without souls that lived outside the garden versus Adam's descendants that did have souls that ultimately intermingled with them?
Well, God gave Adam a specific duty to steward the earth and name all the animals. I know. Have you read G.K. Chesterton, Everlasting Man?
Not that one.
Oh, but it's kind of an early point in it that there's clearly a qualitative difference between these people and just the other animals. So is that somehow similar? We don't see a smart monkey making a half of a cave drawing, for example. We don't see increments. We see it's this and this.
Right. And
does that tie into it?
We can't say that things have a partial free will. We see free will, function of the soul, as a 1-0 thing, on or off.
Yeah.
But
binary.
Then there's the question of so can sentience exist. Like that's the word that atheists love to use about really smart animals or potential aliens. And so, in the frame of question about the soul, like if elephants and dolphins and octopus, etc., if they all got like way smarter, what if they proved that they could do like smart stuff? What would prevent us from like having the observation that maybe these guys have a soul, maybe the guys have free will, and actually there's a designation that's different between intelligence and having a soul. So like, what is that distinction? Because like I feel like people will more readily combine the two of, oh, if you have a soul, that means like you have self-awareness, you have a personality. Dogs have self-awareness and dogs do have personalities, and that's not like a conjecture thing. That is a like verified study thing, you know? So like, what is it that makes man with soul different from man without soul?
That's like almost, it's like verging on being a nonsensical question because of the fact that the soul is what makes it a difference, you know? And like, there's such a large leap there, and I think that's why the church emphasizes it so much, is there's such a huge like categorical leap between our animal instincts and like the nature that we have that's born of the earth and the nature that we have that's from like a gift, like a free gift from God, right, in our free will. Like there's an infinite gap there because one of them is something that can be attained by any living being, and the other one is something that like literally cannot be obtained in any way whatsoever unless it's given, right? Like it's impossible to bridge the gap between point A and point B. And there's the difficulty with humans is that humans obviously, we're body soul composites, and we're the only being that is a body soul composite. So of course we're going to look around at the rest of creation and say, I'm similar to this monkey, and I'm similar to this dolphin, and you know, I'm similar to this plant in some ways. You know, like of course we're going to look around and see the similarities there, but we can't see things that are purely spiritual. Like we can't, like there is great similarity between us and the angels, but we can't see it and we can't know what it is. Mm-hmm. And so when all we have to go on is to look at the physical nature of things and to look at other physical beings and say, they're similar to us because they can do X, Y, and Z that are all physical things. Like, yes, there's an intelligence in all creation because, you know, even plants grow towards the sunlight, right? Like, that's not free will, but that is smart for the plant, right? Like, if a plant doesn't grow towards the sunlight, there's a level of, you know, stupidity that can be attributed towards that plant, right? But no one's arguing that plants are sentient. Just because we have similarities that obviously we can see to physical creation, there's no bridge gap there other than us. Yeah.
And so this is like an interesting part of like hypothetical questioning in the Bible, because now we have Seth and Cain's descendants coexisting with soulless hominids, soulless Homo sapiens. And so when I think about that, the distinction in my mind is all things in nature follow this law of path of least resistance, except for humans. Dogs even follow the path of least resistance. And like regarding parenting versus dog training, that's a distinction that psychologists make of your children will have a sense of good and bad. And even if you don't have necessarily a punishment to tell them what is good and what is bad, they will know that jumping on the couch is misbehaving because it makes you unhappy. And it's not just your unhappiness that's the motivator to stop jumping on the couch, but it's the fact that, like, okay, I want to be good. And that's what's gonna, in that human child sense, prevent them from doing that. Meanwhile, a dog chewing on a couch, that is completely absent in the psychology of a dog. And like, honestly, like for people who have had like grown adult dogs and toddlers at the same time, it's funny how similar their cognitive level is of an obedient dog versus a young baby toddler. But even though that they have that same cognitive like ability, dogs do not have the sense of right and wrong. And even though they could be good boys and good girls, it's really just they figured out what will get them a punishment from their owner and what won't get them a punishment from their owner. And so, in that sense, that's like a kind of a description of what a smart animal would look like in the absence of a true soul or a true free will. And so, the descendants of Adam are all coexisting with these humanoids that do not have a regard for good and evil, that do not have a moral compass or a conscience or free will, and they're just acting on their instincts and what works and what's smart and what's preferable. And sounds like that's a recipe for a lot of terrible things to happen. And so this is the first, like, dang, I like thinking about Genesis in this way,
Yeah.
because it makes the flood seem like way more of a necessary action on God's end, where
Yeah.
like it was fine, like, the non-soul humans can exist outside of the garden with the rest of the animals because they are animals, and that's not immoral. And the humans in the Garden of Eden will be secluded in the Garden of Eden, and they will be good humans obedient to God, and that's not immoral, that's good. But the intermingling of which outside of the garden, once they eat of the tree of fruit knowledge, good and evil, that's when they monkey see, monkey do, right? Like,
Right.
I'm sure there were temptations. Like, there's even like a verse about that's like a debated interpretation of like the daughters of men intermingled with the sons of Seth.
Yeah, the
Oh, the
Nephilim.
Maybe
Nephilim.
that's in reference to like the non-soul humans
The Homo
intermingling with the
sapiens.
soul humans, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I know a lot of people think it's like, fallen angels and humans had babies, but I don't think anyone seriously thinks that's what it says, right? Like,
I mean,
That's
I don't know.
I've never.
It's not like,
I mean, like any
100%
serious, any high level thinker will go like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's. I mean,
I've
let's move on.
I've never heard that point before. That's actually really cool. Yeah, I like that a lot. I think it's cool to relate that a little bit to, like how in the Bible, like periodically, like a people is chosen, right? So like Abraham was chosen out of all people, like King David is chosen out of all people, Israel as a nation is chosen out of all people, and so it. Again, I want to be careful here because this isn't. I don't know what the church's teaching is on what you just said specifically, and I don't want to stray too far into theorizing something that may be antithetical to what the church teaches. But I think that that's a really interesting idea that would seem to make sense biblically, because instead of, again, Adam just being like a, here he is, it's a very clear, like, I've chosen you from all creation, right? And it's very clearly then the Kickstarter of, what the rest of the Bible will become to be a story of. Because then, again, like I said, the rest of the Bible is literally a story of, I've chosen you of all creation to do X mission, right? Culminating in Christianity, which is still, again, a choosing of a specific people above all creation. So, biblically, thematically accurate,
right.
which is cool.
And it is, like, thinking about it in this, like, merged archaeology with Genesis manner does, like, change some of the things that you could take away from these early verses of Genesis. Like, whenever Adam, right before Eve is made, it's God presents a bunch of animals to Adam. He's like, no, none of these are like me. And then God creates the first woman with the soul. And it's like, this one's like me. Maybe that's
Yeah,
more
like,
shaky one.
right? Yeah.
And like, it still might be like Adam and Eve were made spontaneously rather than like they were selected amongst the
Right.
Homo
Yeah.
sapiens. But there's a lot of interesting questions that come up in those early chapters of Genesis. If you just wonder, like, in a scientific or biological lens, what was happening or what was going on, and between humans with souls, humans without souls, and humans with tools without souls, etc. But
So you mentioned the flood. Do you want to? Yeah.
The flood, yeah.
Yes. So that begs the next question. When did the flood happen? And so earlier I mentioned James Ussher, which is the first guy to like really effortfully like make like a creation science account of human history. And he dated the flood to 2349 BC. And that's because again he calculated the date of Abraham's birth and then worked backwards using Genesis chapter 11, which is descendants of Noah all the way to Abraham, where it's when Eber lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he became the father of Reu. When Reu had lived 32 years, etc. So it's just like Genesis 5, but now instead of Adam to Noah, it's Noah to Abraham. And so the question on the archaeological side of things is, what do we have in the world that comes from that date or earlier for before the flood? And it is pretty like one of the places that's like the most popular area of the world to do archaeology in is ancient Egypt. And the Egyptian pyramids are pretty solidly dated to like 2500 to 2400 BC, both of which would be before Noah's flood, according to this James Ussher guy. And so that begs the question of, okay, so did the pyramids already exist whenever the flood happened? If so, there's no flood damage on the pyramids. So that's, now we've arrived at a contradiction between secular archaeology and these years in Genesis that the archbishop used to like put dates to the flood and Noah, etc. And so I watched a really interesting video that was discussing this contention, and turns out in your Bible, any Bible that you guys have at home, the years in Genesis 11 are different in the New King James, the Revised Standard Version, the etc., any of like the most common translations. Those years are all distinct from the years in the Greek Septuagint. And not by a little bit, by a lot of it. It's they add about 650 years to that gap of Noah to Abraham, but depending on what translation of the Old Testament you're using. And if you ask yourself, which translation should we use? Is Aaron here?
Aaron, can you hear us? You good?
Yeah, I don't know. My internet just went out for a second. I don't know.
Okay, well, good thing you're back, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
So, just to reiterate, the dates in all of the Bibles that you would have at home are different from the dates that you would find in the Greek Septuagint. And you might ask yourself, okay, so which one should we trust more? Turns out, if you go into the history of it, this also has to do with why Catholics have a different amount of books in the Bible from the Protestants. Because the oldest copies of the Old Testament we have can go all the way to like around the time of Jesus. The Greek Septuagint was used around the time of Jesus, but it was in Greek. And around many, many years past Jesus, so like, what is it? Around 7th century, 10th century, something like that, that is the oldest that we have for a Hebrew translation of the Old Testament. So that's the Masoretic text. And all of our Torah books in modern day translations take the words from the Masoretic text rather than the Septuagint. And they do disagree oftentimes, but there's a lot of reasons why I would trust the Greek Septuagint more. Reason number one, we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which now is the oldest part of the Hebrew, like, Old Testament scripture. And more often than not, whenever there's a difference between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, they agree with the Septuagint. And so that's a Hebrew text that is corroborating this. They don't have these dates from Genesis because it's an incomplete copy. So that's unfortunate. Number two, the Greek Septuagint is dated to like the 1st century BC, 2nd century BC. So is the Samaritan Pentateuch. And they agree on the years here between Noah and Abraham. Meanwhile, the Masoretic text does not. Third reason, there's a historian from the 1st century, Flavius Josephus.
Josephus, yep. He's the big one.
Was able to read in Hebrew, and he did make an account of history, because he was a historian, of the time of Jesus to early Genesis, how many years happened. He specifies how many years are between Abraham and Noah and Adam. And he says that his source that he uses is the Hebrew Bible. He explicitly says he's not taking the Septuagint as the authority for his history. He's using the older version of the Hebrew Bible that we do not have copies of anymore. And so, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Flavius Josephus, the Samaritan Pentateuch, all agree with the Greek Septuagint regarding these years instead of the Masoretic text. And I can go more into it as to why we should trust this, but essentially it's older, it has more people corroborating with it, it's from the time of Jesus instead of Jews post-Jesus, aka not Christians. And so they're essentially, moving forward in this podcast, we will be taking those years into consideration. And that adds 650 years between Noah and Abraham, which solidly places the pyramids after the flood rather than before the flood. And this arrives to another kind of contradiction that atheists might have found in the Bible, where they're like, okay, the flood happens, and you got like, what? A small family of like 5 people, and after 100 years you have the Tower of Babel. Like, it writes down the number of years between people and then talks about the Tower of Babel, where was an impressive tower. I don't know if I could ever build that with just like a small village of dudes, you know? And so, like, in a population growth standpoint, that's an internal contradiction within the Bible. But if you add all of those years that the Greek Septuagint does have, then suddenly it becomes way more possible. The Tower of Babel event happens about 400 years after the flood, rather than 100 years after the flood. And if you chug the numbers and you plug in population growth, it's reasonable. And also, it's reasonable to build the pyramids then, rather than like just a couple Egyptians with like a few slaves making the pyramids of Giza, you know?
Yeah.
So
no, I know. Sorry. Well, I know. There's discussion about whether the flood was worldwide or just like a certain area. But I guess Egypt would be in that area, right? So yeah. Sorry, continue.
Thoughts, Aaron?
Oh yeah.
No, this is all great. I like it. I remember reading somewhere, and I feel weird that I can't find the source of this, but honestly, I need to do better about remembering the sources of things that I read, because I read so much stuff and then I never remember where it actually came from. But I remember reading somewhere that when they translated a lot of the, specifically numbers, but also other words between Hebrew and Greek, Hebrew was much more of a symbolic language, whereas Greek was written to be much more historical and literal. So it was very common for, especially numbers, to be translated differently between Hebrew and Greek, because the Hebrew language was intended to convey some kind of a bigger meaning, or to fit within the Hebrew context of, these are our important numbers that symbolize something in our religion. And so when we see a number, we're intending for it to symbolize X, Y, or Z. Whereas for Greeks, it was intended to be an actual historical account. yeah, again, I wish I could remember where exactly that came from. But I know that there's a lot of translations that people will talk about where um, the Hebrew numbers are all different from the Greek numbers because they were intended to convey different purposes. Um, and so again, there's a lot of parts where it's like, if you actually take this as being true, like scientifically, and don't look at the deeper meaning and or look at the meaning that they intended to convey with the numbers and the years, that you're missing, part of what was conveyed there.
Yeah. I think this comes up a lot in like New Testament, like apologetics and stuff, but the Jews weren't speaking Hebrew like an everyday language back in that time. Like that was like they'd speak it when they're reading Torah. They'd speak that like when they're discussing things in synagogue. It was very much their like Latin that we have nowadays. Greek was the commerce language that not everyone in the world, but most people in the world spoke back then, just for trading and stuff. So Greek was like their English. And they also spoke Aramaic, I guess, as people, just in everyday life. But yeah, so I used to wonder, it's like, well, why does it seem like all of our earliest sources for this very like Hebrew, like Jewish culture, why do they seem to be in Greek, which is a different language? But it turns out, oh no, they probably all spoke Greek to a certain extent, and like they used it pretty regularly, and it's probably more of a direct, like literal description of how things went. So
And that I think Greek is more so what Flavius Josephus
yeah,
would have been using, and that's why he specified that he was not going off of
I
the
was
Greek Septuagint. But
he felt the need to say I'm not using that one,
Mhm.
right? So yeah,
and so to recap, we now have differed from James Ussher, the 1650s bishop, because we're following a first century historian now about
yeah.
Genesis dates. But
Flavius
earlier,
Josephus does all the heavy lifting for Christian.
so earlier we compared the Garden of Eden, aka time when God gave human souls, to the start of human civilization, or at least the earliest evidence of human civilization we have for like Mesopotamia. And we said, oh, it's the same year, 4000 BC, 4000 BC. But now, if we're using the new numbers that we're referring to in the Greek Septuagint, turns out there's even more differences in Genesis chapter 5. And so the dates push all the way back to 5500 BC. But when you really think about it, what would you expect for our earliest archaeological evidence to date back of civilization, to date back to the exact first time that humans got souls, or whenever they populated it enough, hundreds and maybe thousands of years later? And then also like archaeology, the vast majority of things that humans made are not discovered in archaeology,
Yeah.
So it's unreasonable to like actually get the same date lined up, but it's more believable that 5500 BC, Adam and Eve leave the garden, and they have 1500 years before like organized cities in Mesopotamia actually start popping up that are well preserved enough for us to see in the modern day.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's another thing Chesterton said, and it's that the earliest like records of human civilization of like humans we find indicate that like humanity predates human like discovery of humanity. So like we haven't found the physical remains of like the first humans yet, or anywhere near it, pretty much.
So we've covered when were the first humans. We've covered when was the first civilization. But now the last question to ask is, when did empires start happening? Yep. And so the earliest human empire that we have evidence for is the Akkadian Empire. It predates the Egyptian Empire by a decent bit. And to define that, it's different from a civilization, because civilization, like, yes, there's a government, yes, there's an urban structure. But an empire is different because now it's multiple territories all falling under one rule of generally one person, the emperor. And so the Akkadian Empire, that would have been a contradiction to the flood as well, because the earliest evidence we have of that is 2330 BC, which for the Masoretic text, the James Ussher timeline, that would have happened at the same time as the flood. And generally, empires don't start at the same time as everything being flooded, you know? But now it is an appropriate amount of time after humanity restarting to where now there's more people. And essentially, this one guy that we do have historical accounts of, his name is Sargon of Akkad. He had
Sargon.
Sargon, right?
It's an awesome name.
Yeah.
He had power in the city of Akkad, and he started conquests that took control of the major cities in the Mesopotamia region. And so this is the empire that we get like the Epic of Gilgamesh from, for instance, which also has a flood narrative in, and so it makes sense to place that after the flood rather than before the flood. And so you might wonder, okay, if this guy was such a hotshot, why isn't it mentioned at all in the Bible? But the Egyptian empire is mentioned in the Bible. And that's where I say to you, I think it is. So we're going to flip to, like Genesis, I think 10, maybe? Yeah, 10. So this is when the Bible first starts saying the names of Noah's descendants. Not just the line of Shem, but also of Ham and Japheth. And let me find the part. Okay. So this is the part about Ham, where his descendants like populate Egypt, etc. The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabtha, Rama, and Saptka. The sons of Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, and then it starts talking more and more about Nimrod, and then it goes back to listing descendants of Noah. All of these descendants of Noah are sharing one verse with 5 other names, except Nimrod gets like 3 about just how great of a guy he is, and how strong of a hunter he is, and where he settled, and where he started like beginning his kingdom. And you look at this, and it lists 3 cities. It lists 3 cities that are in Nimrod's kingdom: Babel, Erech, and Akkad. Those are 3 of the cities that are in the Akkadian Empire. In fact, those are 3 cities at the heart of the Akkadian Empire. And so, if you now think in the lens of who's Nimrod in history, a lot of people, hypothetically, a lot of historians like to compare, maybe Nimrod is Sargon of Akkad. And that's why the Bible has an account of him. That's why we have an account of him, because this guy was a mighty man. And what is Nimrod known for? He's known for being powerful, taking over cities, and being proud. But we're going to get to that later. And so what I think is either he is Sargon, or he's at least Sargon's dad. And he laid the foundation for Sargon to later continue the conquests and create his empire. But this verse about Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10 also play into the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, where it's the plain of Shinar, so the same exact area that Nimrod settled, and it's talking about the kingdom that he's establishing. Men want to build this great tower that's going to reach all the way to heaven and touch God. And we know this story as God sees this. He identifies it as not good, as in this is hubris. Humans are trying to reach for God on their own strength, and then he disperses the people and creates different languages. And so we look at the sin of Nimrod of, okay, Nimrod is the first great man. He is seizing power over multiple cities, and he's trying to make a name for himself. That's what it repeats in Genesis, and we're going to make a name for ourselves. What is the thing that makes empire and empire in archaeology. One guy getting really ambitious, taking control of other places, and wanting to make a name for himself and go down in infamy in history. And so we have Nimrod, who is alive around the same time. He is conquering the same places. He is committing the same sins as Sargon of Akkad. And right after the Tower of Babel event is when we have the start in, like, secular timeline-wise, the Akkadian Empire. And so that's the last connection to draw for today of the first empire actually is described in the Bible. It has a few verses, and it is met with God punishing humanity because we're not supposed to seize God.
Well, yeah, great. That was really cool. No, it's just like you make me want to like go and like read some of this stuff because like I don't know, just the ability to like draw those connections and realize like things are more like associated with each other than you realized.
Yeah, I love that. I love all of that. I think it's really cool for me, especially of like the more poetically I tend to read the Bible now than I did before. I always say this, like high school me would be rolling over in his grave listening to me talk about poetry now. So I hated poetry and writing with like a burning passion in high school, and now I'm like, oh, like look at all this poetic language in the Bible, and you know, yeah, it's really cool, especially to draw those parallels between like the stuff that you talked about is not stuff that I like make it my business very often to learn, and I for one, like Ryan said, I want to go do that now because it's awesome to see. But it's just so cool to see the way that those fit together very well, and to see like how the Bible really does teach us a lot about early human history, and like how that, you know, it's a big feedback loop with scientific discovery as well. Like we're able to check ourselves very well because of, you know, the historical accounts of the greatest of which is usually the Bible. Ways that we're able to, again, like a feedback loop, like check ourselves and look and see what we can discover and how it relates to, you know, what it means to be fully human. So just, yeah, thank you for coming on and talking about all this stuff, because I think it's just one of the coolest things ever about the faith, and it's just cool, so cool to explore.
Yeah.
No, like if you read more of Genesis with that like mindset, like the boring verses become interesting. Whenever they just list descendants of Noah, like that's actually what historians get to refer to as the Table of Nations. And like you could pull up maps and like shows like which cities and which empires started from which descendants of Noah. Because it kind of gives you an indication of Egypt came from the son of Ham named Egypt.
Yeah.
You know?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, now I've got to look up every single one of these guys, because I'm sure there's an extensive like historical palette for Reu, Pellet. Wait.
Yeah, and it's I mean, the Holy Spirit's the co-author, right? So there's not an unimportant word in Scripture. You know, there's some reason for all of it.
Yeah. Well, does that conclude our topics?
Pretty much. So like the main goal is you don't have to have a schism between like thinking academically versus thinking spiritually. Like that. Yeah. Essentially what I'm trying to describe is a way to read early Genesis that doesn't contradict evolution or archaeology or the church. And I see no problem with that, you know? Like you don't need to have cognitive dissonance about this. It's things add up nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And I think just to bring a last point in, I think one of the most important things to realize is that when there is cognitive dissonance, it's because usually you're focusing too heavily on one side or the other, you know? So like having a well-balanced reading of the Bible, and more importantly, like a well-balanced faith life, is what's going to lead you to having harmony in all of those areas. Like I know that, you know, we all have good faith formation, like we're all very intellectually formed, but we're also very well formed in the areas of prayer, and we make, you know, good devotions, and we practice our faith with, great sincerity. And so there's a great beauty in how all of that helps form you together. And normally when you tend to follow conspiracy theories, or you fall really far to one side or the other, it's just because you're weighting one thing too heavily. So there's always just a call to be, very centered within your faith, and to let all of it inform other things. Like, I'm going to let my spirituality inform the things that Ian just, graciously laid upon us, and I'm also going to let the things that Ian graciously laid upon us inform my spirituality. And it's all just a big feedback loop that increases, our love for the faith. So wonderful.
And if you spend time on like these hypothetical headcanons, like within faith, it is very important. I can't emphasize enough. It's like actually read as to what the church specifically denies.
Yeah,
like there's a hard line that they draw, and it's there for a reason. Like,
but what if the fruit represents humans gaining intelligence? I thought that for a long time. I thought, oh, that's a neat idea.
Fruit of knowledge.
Yeah. Also explains why childbirth hurts now, because our heads got bigger. But, that's a heresy. You can't. That's out of bounds.
That's a fun heresy, though. You don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe this could be something to talk about again another time.
Oh, of course.
One of the really fun ones that I spent time on thinking about in high school is nowhere in church doctrine does it specify that you cannot believe in the multiverse. And that is more sci-fi than like hard science. But like thinking about like what kind of faith implications that has is cool to me. Like regarding free will specifically.
Yeah.
Of like Loki, the TV show, really does imply that the multiverse is what makes free will, and otherwise you can't have it. And like that's something that some people like have trouble swallowing. That's kind of why predestination is a question that people like dwell on so much, because they can't wrap their head around an all-knowing God like knowing the timeline without us also not having free will or having free will.
Yeah.
And yeah.
That is a conversation I would love to sit back and just watch you and Ryan like go at for an hour. That's
well, if there's a multiverse and God exists in one of those multiverses, it then follows that God exists in all the multiverses.
God would transcend the multiverse.
Yeah, he'd have to. That's the point, right? So you'd have to either say God must exist or God can't exist. There's no God could exist.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. Thanks for having me on the show, guys.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all for watching.